What if I told you the real danger isn't ignorance, but intelligent people who've stopped thinking? Not bad people, but good people. People like you, like me. People who are kind, educated, well-meaning, and sleepwalking into disaster. Because here's the truth. No one wants to say out loud, stupidity isn't the opposite of intelligence. It's what happens when smart minds surrender, when we trade complexity for comfort, when we stop thinking, not because we can't, but because we believe it doesn't matter anymore. And in a world ruled by algorithms, attention spans, and outrage economics, that surrender is no longer a flaw. It's a feature. You're about to hear a theory so unsettling, it got the man who wrote it killed. But if you stay, if you listen past the discomfort, what you'll find isn't fear. It's freedom. So breathe deep. And if you believe in the power of thought, really believe, then like, subscribe, share this with someone who's still awake. Because now more than ever, thinking is an act of resistance. It never starts with something dramatic, not with shouting or riots or big, loud speeches. It starts small, quiet, with people choosing not to speak up, with neighbors saying, "Well, that's not my business," with smart, kind people slowly giving up on asking hard questions just because it's easier not to. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw. He wasn't just a preacher or a thinker. He lived through it. He watched Germany, an educated, proud, modern country, fall under the spell of a simple story. A lie repeated often enough that even the smartest people started to believe, not because they were bad, but because they were tired and scared and didn't want to rock the boat. They chose silence, and silence can be deadly. See, Bonhoeffer didn't start by warning people about evil. He started by warning them about comfort. Because when people get comfortable, they stop paying attention. They stop asking questions. They stop noticing when something doesn't sit right. They say things like, "It's probably fine," or "That's not my problem," or "Someone else will deal with it." But no one does. And over time, wrong ideas don't just survive, they grow. And here's the scary part. Those wrong ideas don't need to be forced on people. They just need to be repeated enough until they feel normal. That's what Bonhoeffer meant when he said, "We are defenseless against stupidity," because it's not about being dumb. It's about choosing not to think. Choosing the easy answer, the popular answer, the fast one. And once that becomes a habit, it's hard to break. Smart people start saying dumb things. Kind people start supporting cruel things. And no one thinks they're doing anything wrong. They think they're just doing what makes sense. But what makes sense isn't always what's right. That's the trick, really. Most people don't support bad things because they're bad. They support them because they're familiar, because everyone else around them seems okay with it, because it's easier than standing out, because thinking takes time, and time is something most people don't feel like they have. Bonhoeffer saw this in churches, in schools, in courts, places full of smart, thoughtful people who suddenly stopped thinking. He didn't blame them for being stupid. He blamed the system that made thinking harder than just going along. And the truth is that's still happening. Today, it doesn't look like a dictator shouting on a stage. It looks like a news feed, a headline, a post that goes viral, not because it's true, but because it's easy to believe. And when you see it 10, 20, 100 times, it sticks. You stop asking, "Is this true?" You just think, "Well, I've seen it a lot. It must be." That's the new kind of stupidity. Not loud, not angry, just automatic. And the scariest part? Most of us don't even notice when we've stopped thinking because it feels normal. You're tired. You've got a job. You've got bills. You don't have time to research everything. So you scroll, you skim, you repeat what sounds right, what feels right. But Bonhoeffer would say, that's when it matters most. That moment when your brain says, don't think too hard. That's the exact moment to stop and think, because thinking is hard. And that's the point. Anyone can repeat. Anyone can react. But to pause, to actually wonder if you might be wrong, that takes courage. So maybe courage today isn't about fighting in the streets. Maybe it's about choosing to think, even when it's uncomfortable. Maybe it's about asking hard questions, even when they don't have easy answers. And maybe it's as simple as this. The next time you're about to hit share stop, ask yourself, do I know this is true? Do I understand this? Or just agree with it? That moment of doubt, that's the beginning of resistance. And if this made you stop, even for a second, then let it be a sign. Like, subscribe. Share this with someone who still believes thinking matters. Someone who knows silence isn't always peace. Someone who's not afraid to pause. Because this journey doesn't end here. We've talked about silence. Now let's talk about systems. Because sometimes stupidity isn't just a personal choice. Sometimes it's the result of a world built to keep us from thinking at all. Because Bonhoeffer wasn't just worried about individuals making bad choices. He was worried about what happens when whole systems make thinking harder. Think about it. Who has time to sit down and read a book these days? Who gets rewarded for asking hard questions, for being uncertain, for changing their mind? Not many of us. But we do get rewarded for being fast, for being loud, for having strong opinions, even if they're half-baked. That's not an accident. That's how the machine works now. Social media runs on outrage. The news runs on fear. Our attention is sliced up and sold by the second. And deep thought, careful reflection, there's no profit in that. So we get less of it, and slowly thinking becomes a kind of rebellion. A quiet kind. The kind you do with a notebook, with a long walk, with a question no one wants to hear. That's the kind of rebellion Bonhoeffer died for. Not with fists, with thought. He believed the world only changes when people stop and ask, "Wait, is this right?" So maybe today, that's your act of resistance. Not changing the world, just stopping for a moment to think. And in that moment, you remember something important. You don't have to believe what's easy. You don't have to repeat what's popular. You can choose to think, even if it costs you, especially if it does. Let's talk about pressure, not the kind you see. Not someone yelling at you or telling you what to believe. I'm talking about quiet pressure, systemic pressure, the kind that's baked into your daily life. You feel it when your phone lights up with news you didn't ask for. When you're rushing to get to work, worrying about bills, and still somehow expected to have an opinion about everything going on in the world. It's exhausting. So you do what makes sense. You simplify. You trust shortcuts. You follow the crowd. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to survive. That's what economists call rational ignorance. It means it actually makes sense to stay uninformed because the cost of understanding something deeply is higher than the reward. And when whole societies live like that, stupidity stops being a personal problem. It becomes an economic system. Think about how much is demanded from you every single day. You're expected to work long hours, pay rising prices, manage stress, stay informed, be polite, be efficient, be productive, and somehow also be wise. But wisdom takes time. It takes silence. It takes the space to doubt, to learn to make mistakes, and reflect. Most people don't get that space. Instead, they get feeds, notifications, breaking news, hot takes. And when you're moving that fast, real thinking starts to feel like a luxury. Bonhoeffer saw this even in the 1940s. He noticed how people didn't stop thinking all at once. It was a slow drift, a quiet giving up. And in our world, that drift is even easier, because now your phone doesn't just distract you. It studies you. It learns your preferences, your fears, your attention span, and then shapes what you see based on what will keep you watching, not what's true, what's sticky. And when whole economies depend on keeping you scrolling, arguing, and buying, do you think they really want you to stop and think? Of course not. They want you reactive, predictable, clickable, because thoughtful people don't buy on impulse. They pause, and pausing doesn't pay. That's why the smartest platforms in the world, built by the brightest engineers, are designed to bypass your brain, not engage it. They use speed, repetition, emotion. They reward rage, certainty, simplicity, not because the people behind them are evil, but because outrage keeps you engaged, and engagement makes money. It's business, not conspiracy, and that's the real danger. Because when the world rewards knee-jerk reactions more than careful thought, what kind of minds do we end up growing? Not curious ones, but quick ones. Ones that memorize slogans instead of exploring ideas. Ones that follow trends instead of following questions. Ones that shout first and never circle back. And the more this happens, the more isolated real thinking becomes. People start to feel weird for hesitating, for being unsure, for saying, "I don't know." But that's exactly where thought begins. Not in knowing, in not knowing. So what do you do in a world like this? How do you push back when the pressure to surrender your attention is everywhere? You do something small. You make time for boredom. You take a walk witut your phone. You read one article all the way through instead of 10 headlines in 10 seconds. You ask one real question a day and don't rush to answer it. Because the truth is, no system can stop you from thinking, but it can make you forget how, and that's why this matters. Thinking won't get you paid. It won't go viral, but it will keep you free. Bonhoeffer knew that. He saw what happens when comfort becomes more important than conscience, when simplicity wins over truth, when people stop thinking, not because they can't, but because they believe it doesn't matter anymore. He spent his last years in prison, watching smart people make dumb decisions with full hearts and empty minds. And if he were here now, he wouldn't scream. He'd ask, "Have you stopped thinking?" If the answer's yes, even a little, then maybe this is your chance to pause, to breathe, to remember that you don't owe the world your reaction. You owe it your reflection. So if this made you stop even for a second, like, subscribe, share this with someone who still cares about thinking, who wants more than noise. Because up next, we'll talk about something deeper, not just the pressure to stop thinking, but the way our own minds, our own instincts, can betray us too. Because this isn't just about platforms and ads. It's about what happens inside you. What happens when you start believing that being loud is the same as being right. That having an answer is more important than having a question. What happens when we build a world where the smartest people don't speak up because they know how messy truth really is? and the loudest voices take their place. A world where quick takes win and slow thought feels like weakness. Bonhoeffer warned us, the real threat isn't evil people doing evil things. It's good people caught in systems that make thinking feel like a burden. And when that happens, stupidity becomes efficient, profitable, normal. But it's not inevitable. You can still choose depth over speed, curiosity over certainty, silence over performance. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we start reclaiming what Bonhoeffer died trying to protect. The simple, radical act of not knowing everything, of wondering out loud, of staying curious even when it's easier not to be. That's where we go next. So here's the twist. Even if you escape the noise, even if you unplug from the algorithms, mute the headlines, take a deep breath, you're still not safe. Because the real threat doesn't just live out there. It lives in here, in your brain. Bonhoeffer saw it too, though he didn't have the science to name it. He just watched how otherwise thoughtful people, once put in groups or under pressure, suddenly stopped thinking. Today, we call that cognitive bias, and your brain is full of it, not because you're broken, but because you're human. Your mind was built for survival, not truth. It cuts corners, skips steps, grabs the answer that feels right even if it isn't. Take confirmation bias, for example. That's the one where your brain looks for evidence to prove you're already right and ignores the rest. Or the familiarity effect. The more times you hear something, the more true it feels, even if it's a lie. Then there's groupthink, where you go along with the crowd, not because you agree, but because disagreement feels risky. These aren't flaws in your character. They're features of your wiring. They helped your ancestors survive on the savannah. They made sense when danger was sudden and decisions had to be fast. But now they make you vulnerable to manipulation that feels like common sense. And when the system outside you is designed to amplify these blind spots, it creates a loop. Your instincts feed the algorithm. The algorithm feeds your instincts. Before long, you're not choosing what to believe. You're being led there, step by step, by your own brain. And that's what makes this era different. It's not just that misinformation exists. It's that your mind wants to believe it, especially when it's simple, especially when it confirms what you already feel, especially when it gives you someone to blame. And here's where the machines come in. AI doesn't just know facts, it knows patterns. And those patterns include your bias, your fears, your rhythms. It sees when you hesitate, when you click, when you scroll back. And it learns, not in some far-off future now. It learns what makes you angry, what makes you feel seen, what makes you feel certain. And then it shows you more of that. It doesn't need to know what's true, just what works and what works best. emotion, outrage, fear, because those things bypass thinking. They go straight to your gut. And when the system keeps serving you those emotions, day after day, swipe after swipe, your brain doesn't stand a chance. You start thinking less, feeling more, reacting faster, until your thoughts aren't really your own. They're responses, predictable, automatic. You're not being programmed, you're just being nudged. And that's more dangerous, because being nudged doesn't feel like control. It feels like choice, like I just knew it, like everyone agrees, like it's obvious. And when something feels obvious, you stop questioning, you stop thinking. But here's the catch. AI can't force you to believe something. It can only increase the odds that you'll choose the easy path. The simple answer. The quick outrage. The rest, that's on you. And that's the hardest part to admit, because it means your freedom, your actual lived freedom, comes down to whether you're willing to slow down, to check yourself, to ask, do I believe this because it's true, or because it feels good? In a world built to make thinking rare, just pausing is an act of rebellion. So if you've made it this far, stop and breathe. Like, subscribe. Share this with someone who wants to understand, not just win arguments. Because next, we go deeper into what happens when stupidity isn't just accidental, but intentional and designed. Because here's the terrifying truth. The people building these systems, they're not guessing. They run experiments, thousands of them, every second. They test how long you pause on a sad story. What kind of face makes you angry? What words make you feel powerful? And then they optimize, not for truth, for engagement. That means the more emotional you get, the more attention you give. The more attention you give, the more data they get. And the more data they get, the better they get at predicting your next move. This isn't evil. It's efficient. But the result, a world where the fastest spreading ideas are rarely the truest, and where you, no matter how smart or careful, can be caught in a loop where everything feels true simply because it's familiar. That's not stupidity, that's design. So here's what matters now. Not how smart you are, but how slow you're willing to go, how much doubt you're willing to sit with, how much silence you're willing to hear. Because AI will keep learning, but so can you. And unlike the machine, you get to choose what kind of mind you want to become. Now, let's take everything we've seen. How systems reward shortcuts, how our brains fall for patterns, how AI nudges us without us noticing, and ask the next question. What happens when this isn't just an accident? What if stupidity in the modern world isn't a bug, but a feature? Not something we fall into, but something we choose willingly, quietly, without even realizing we've done it. Because in a world this loud, this fast, and this overwhelming thinking isn't just difficult, it's painful. And sometimes, without knowing, we start to want the pain to stop. So we trade thought for comfort, not because we're lazy, because we're tired. And here's where it gets truly dangerous. Because once we start choosing comfort over clarity, we begin to shape our world to match that choice. We unfollow people who challenge us. We block discomfort. We silence complexity. We start saying things like, "I don't want to argue," when we really mean, "I don't want to think too hard." And the systems around us say, "Great, let us help you." They give us cleaner filters, sharper headlines, simpler answers. They say, "Don't worry about nuance. We've got the version of truth that feels right for you." It sounds like freedom, but it's really a trap, because the more personalized your world becomes, the smaller it gets. You stop seeing contradiction. You stop seeing discomfort. And eventually, you stop seeing reality. You see only what agrees with you, only what comforts you. And at that point, you're not being lied to. You're lying to yourself. And that's what makes the modern version of stupidity so different from the past. It's not imposed. It's curated. It's not shouted at you. It's whispered gently by an interface that knows you better than you know yourself. That's the new trap. Not forced ignorance, but chosen ignorance. And the worst part? It doesn't feel like ignorance at all. It feels like peace. It feels like control. It feels like finally the world makes sense, because you've cut out everything that doesn't. Bonhoeffer never saw an algorithm. He never scrolled through a feed or got lost in a comment section, but he understood this tendency. He saw how people, when faced with a complicated and painful truth, would choose a simpler and safer lie. He called it intellectual surrender. Not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of courage. And today, that courage is more rare than ever. Because now the truth doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It makes you feel alone. Like you're the only one not outraged, not convinced, not on board. And in a digital world where consensus is visible, where likes and shares and ratios speak louder than evidence, being uncertain starts to feel like being wrong. So we hide our questions. We mask our confusion. And little by little, we stop asking altogether. But here's the thing Bonhoeffer wanted us to remember. Truth is not supposed to feel safe. Growth is not supposed to feel easy. Thinking real. Thinking isn't something you stumble into. It's something you choose again and again, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. So if you've ever felt that urge to scroll past the hard stuff, to skip the long read, to ignore the thing that makes your stomach twist, you're not alone. We all feel it. But that's exactly the moment to pause, to ask, why am I avoiding this? because that question, that pause, that's the first sign you're still free. Not from control, but from surrender. And maybe that's the true test. Now, not how much we know or how right we are, but whether we still have the strength to stay curious, to feel uncomfortable, and stay anyway. If this message made something stir in you, subscribe. Share it with someone who still wants more than agreement. Someone who can sit with complexity and not run. Because next we talk about resistance, not the kind that fights back with fists, but with questions, the kind Bonhoeffer gave his life for. So what does resistance look like? Not the big, dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that starts not with speeches or protests, but with silence, with discomfort, with a simple decision to sit still with a thought that doesn't fit neatly into your worldview. Bonhoeffer called this costly grace, because to resist stupidity, to think for yourself, to hold space for doubt, to stay open in a world that rewards certainty, costs something. It costs comfort. It costs belonging. It costs your illusion of control. And that's why so few people do it. Because real thinking isn't glamorous. It's not rewarded with likes or applause. It's quiet, private, often invisible. It happens when you pause before reacting. When you read the whole article, not just the headline. When you say, "I don't know," out loud and mean it. It happens when you read something that makes you uncomfortable and keep reading. That's resistance. Not shouting louder, but listening deeper. Not fighting every battle, but choosing one idea, one question, and holding it even when everyone else has moved on. And that's hard, because we live in a world that's constantly moving. Faster feeds, hotter takes, shorter thoughts. We're trained to scan, skim, react. But resistance asks us to stop, to stretch time, to protect a space inside us where thoughts aren't rushed. And in that space, we find ourselves again. Because here's the truth. Most people avoid. Thinking is uncomfortable. That's why most people outsource it. To headlines, to influencers, to whatever's trending. But when you stop outsourcing, when you carry the weight of your questions yourself, you begin to grow, not louder, but deeper, not more certain, but more honest. And maybe that's what this world needs most. Not more certainty, but more honesty. More people willing to say, "I'm still learning." More people willing to ask, "What if I'm wrong?" More people willing to admit, "I don't know yet, but I want to." Bonhoeffer didn't just die for truth. He lived for thinking. He believed that choosing to reflect when everything pushes you to react is one of the last dignities we have left. And in that sense, thinking is love. It's what you do when you care enough not to treat the world like a soundbite. It's what you offer when you believe people deserve more than your first reaction. So here's the challenge. Pick one belief you're sure of, and go find the strongest argument against it. Not to torture yourself, not to change your mind, just to see if your thinking is alive. Because if it is, if you're still asking, still doubting, still reaching, then you haven't surrendered. You've begun. So subscribe, share this with someone who still believes thinking matters, not just for knowledge, but for freedom and for love. If you've made it this far, thank you. Not for watching, for thinking, for pausing, for sitting with the hard parts, for choosing discomfort over ease, doubt over performance. In a time like this, that's not small, that's everything. So here's what I hope for you, truly. May your mind stay open. May your questions stay alive. And may you always have the courage to say, I don't know, but I want to. If this spoke to you, if it stirred something real, don't just scroll away. Share it, quietly, thoughtfully, with one peep, because truth spreads slow, but so does light. And you might be someone's first flicker. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay awake, stay human, stay thinking.